I want to start with a question, and I think it's a question that's at the very center of things that divide us in our culture today. That question is this: is God real or imaginary? And there are very powerful voices in our culture today that want to say that God is imaginary, that belief in God is delusional, in fact. And you may have come across some of these authors. In 2006, 7, 8, there was a whole spate of books that came out that formed a literary genre called the New Atheism. And the idea of the New Atheism is that science, properly understood, makes belief in God untenable or extremely implausible. That science has shown that belief in God is, in fact, a delusion. Now, there are a number of these authors. Richard Dawkins, who's written The God Delusion. Daniel Dennett wrote Breaking the Spell, where the spell is religious belief. Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens, who wrote the book God is Not Great. So many of you may have encountered these. I had someone come up to me between services or before the first service and say, I put on Facebook last night that I was at the conference, and I was already she said, I already got pushback from all my cousins who said, no, you can't consider those ideas, and they were citing these books. So let me review the argument of the New Atheist. Richard Dawkins says that the best reason for belief in God was always the evidence of design in nature, the classical design argument. But now we know that there is no evidence of design, only the appearance of design. And we know that because of Darwin. Darwin showed that all organisms indeed appear to be designed, but that appearance is an illusion because there's an unguided, undirected process, namely natural selection acting on random variations, that produces that appearance without itself being guided or directed in any way. The mechanism of natural selection is a kind of designer substitute. The Darwinian biologists tell us we have design, the appearance of design at least, without a designer. That's a classical Darwinian formulation. And so Dawkins says, in light of Darwin, in light of everything we've learned since the 19th century in science, we really can't talk about design, and since there's no design, there is no designer, no real design, there's no actual designer. And if there's no designer, there can't be any such person as God. So belief in God, while not absolutely disproven, is tantamount to a delusion. It's a belief you must hold without any objective public evidence that you can point to. If you read a modern biology textbook, there is only one view of biological origins presented, and that is the Darwinian view. In fact, many times, even the criticisms of Darwinian theory that exist in the peer-reviewed scientific literature are not mentioned in biology textbooks. I mean, almost always. The point there is that as you get into the biological literature today, you find that there are many scientists, even evolutionary theorists, who are calling for a new theory of evolution because they recognize that natural selection and random mutation have very limited creative power. The central driving mechanism of Darwinism is being increasingly questioned in the scientific literature, but you'll get no hint of that in a modern biology textbook. And that's actually one of the themes of my new book, Darwin's Doubt, is that there's a huge disparity between the public presentation of Darwin's theory, as you find it in the biology textbooks and by people like Richard Dawkins, and the actual status of the theory as you find it in the peer-reviewed biological literature, even in the field of evolutionary biology. Anyway, setting that aside, my point is that there is a default way of thinking. Everyone does have a worldview. And the default way of thinking in our elite culture, in our knowledge culture, in the universities, in the law schools, in the courts, in the media, is very much influenced by this, what's called scientific materialism. Many people couldn't name scientific materialism, but they would have an understanding of reality that would be very much materialistic. What's the thing from which everything else came? Oh, well, that evolutionary process produced us. Is there an objective morality? No, of course not, because there's no God above us all that can say what the objective moral standards are. Morality is just relative. You have your moral preferences, I have mine, and whatever floats your boat. Are we capable of making free choices, and can we be held accountable for our actions? No, everyone's determined by their genes and their environment. There's a little cartoon in the Wall Street Journal recently. A guy's standing before a judge, and he says, "Not guilty by reason of millions of years of evolutionary selection for aggressive behavior, Your Honor." A lot of people are talking about this. Why is no one accountable for their actions anymore? Why is everyone a victim of genes? That's an expression of an underlying worldview. And so it affects our culture in all kinds of different ways. It affects students, too. When they go off to college, what happens to Christian students these days? With an incredibly high frequency. Your freshmen, your sophomores coming back. Very often, the first 2 years of college are killing fields for traditional religious belief. Christian, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, kids is the same story. Okay? Why? Because there is the dominant worldview among the professorate is very much hostile to theism. In fact, it is very much a naturalistic or materialistic worldview. And students get to college and they find, hey, it's like everybody else, all these smart people are thinking differently than I am, and I didn't get the memo. And it starts to erode their confidence in what they the beliefs with which they were raised. Now, many professors, in fact, think, and media people in the knowledge culture, think that the materialistic worldview is the right one because science supports it. And they're right. It does. The science of the 19th century supports the materialistic worldview. And what I'm going to talk about in the second part of my talk now is what has been going on beneath the radar of those popularizers for science. You may know there's this big thing on Fox right now, the Cosmos series. And it starts out with the mantra, the motto of the scientific materialist. The universe is all there is, and all there ever was, and all there ever will be. Carl Sagan said that back in 1980. They're recycling it now for popular consumption. The evidence contradicts that mantra, and I want to talk about that now. There have been three great discoveries in 20th century and early 21st century science that I think challenge this materialistic worldview and instead point in a decidedly theistic direction. And I call this shift the return of the God hypothesis. The change in direction started in the 1920s in the field of cosmology. It started with a number of figures, but one important one was an astronomer who had been a lawyer named Edwin Hubble. He came into astronomy at a very propitious time, right as astronomers were building these great dome telescopes that could, in a sense, magnify the images coming from outer space with a precision that had been unrivaled, nothing like anything we'd been able to do before. They were able to resolve these tiny points of light and to show what they were. Now, when Hubble first came into astronomy, and this is a photograph of him in front of his telescope, it was still debated as to whether or not we were in our solar system was in the only galaxy or not. Our Milky Way galaxy. Was it the only galaxy or are there others? And one of the first things that Hubble was able to establish is that there were galaxies galore out in the night sky. Little tiny points of light that might have been stars revealed these massive structures. This is one of his photographic plates of a spindle nebula. Here's another of a spiral nebula. And this is a picture, a more modern picture, that's called the Hubble Deep Field. And this is just extraordinary. It's a little tiny quadrant of the night sky. And what you can see upon these great powers of magnification is that it's full of galaxies in every direction. And so as you begin to weigh all this, you realize, first of all, that Hubble discovered that we live in an immense universe. It's extraordinarily large. The second thing he discovered was that the galaxies are moving away from us in every direction that you investigate. And the way he discovered this is that there's light coming from the distant galaxies. And the light coming from the distant galaxies is it's shifted in the red direction of the ultraviolet spectrum. If you shine light through a prism, you know how the light will separate into different colors. The red end of the spectrum corresponds to light with long wavelengths. And you may know that sound has a similar property. If there's a train moving away from you, what will happen to the pitch of the sound? It'll shift lower, and the lower sound corresponds to a long wavelength. So as the astronomers realized that the light was being shifted towards the long wavelength, the red end of the spectrum, they realized that what that meant is that the objects in the night sky, these galaxies, were moving away from us. And as they investigated different quadrants of the night sky, they found that the galaxies in every direction were doing this, which suggested something really amazing. And I have a visual aid. If you go forward in time, what's happening to the universe if everything is moving away from us and from everything else? It's expanding. Time 1, time 2, time 3, the universe is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now that's pretty cool, but then if you think, well, what about if you wind the clock backwards in your mind? You see those Saturday morning cartoons where the Bugs Bunny suddenly, goes back? Well, the astronomers started thinking about that, and they realized that as you go back in time, the universe would be smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until finally you get to a point that marked the beginning of the expansion, where all those galaxies were together, and then as you move forward in time, we're expanding outward. In other words, it looked as though there was a beginning point to the expansion, and then quite probably a beginning point to the universe itself. The universe wasn't eternal and self-existent. It might not have been here forever, as Carl Sagan has said. Now, so this was a pretty mind-blowing conclusion, and it got the attention of a famous scientist who was, by this time, come from Germany to America. He was well known for his bad hair and his heavy German accent, a guy named Einstein. Einstein had a theory of gravity that he pioneered in the 19-teens called general relativity. The idea was that the massive objects would actually curve space, and that accounted for the motion of other objects around them. Now, one of the implications of his theory, fell out of the mathematics of the theory, was that the universe was currently expanding outward and decelerating. Kind of like if you light a firecracker, it would go bang, and then the shrapnel from the firecracker would flutter to the ground slowly. So the universe is expanding outward, but expanding outward from an initial point of expansion. In other words, the math of general relativity implied that there was a beginning to the universe. And this troubled Einstein a lot, because at this point in his career, he was really committed to this materialistic worldview, the idea of the eternal, self-existent, the infinite universe. And so Einstein, troubled by this as he was, started fiddling with his equations. And he inserted into them an arbitrary factor called the cosmological constant. And he gave it an arbitrary value that would make the force of expansion and the force of gravitation come into exact balance. Now, there was no physical justification for inserting this cosmological constant into his equations, except that it got rid of the odious idea of a beginning to the universe. So he lived with this for a little while and thought this was pretty peachy, but then he's got a telegram from Hubble, who told him what he had seen. In a sense, the heavens had talked back. And they had their own testimony as to whether there was a beginning or not to the universe. And later, Hubble invited Einstein out to the Palomar Observatory at Mount Wilson to see what he had been seeing. And there's some famous newsreel footage where Hubble, who's got the pipe in the picture, and Einstein and another astronomer went into this big dome telescope, and then Einstein came out, having seen the evidence for the redshift and the expanding universe, and he came out and announced to the media, in his heavy German accent, he said, "I now see the necessity of a beginning." And he later said the cosmological constant that he had proposed without justification was the greatest mistake of his scientific career. So the combination of general relativity and the evidence of the expanding universe conjoined came together to support the idea of a definite beginning to the universe, the idea that the universe was finite. Now, this upset a lot of other scientists, including the great British astrophysicist Sir Arthur Eddington, who said in response, he was trying to formulate a different theory, he said, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order is repugnant to me. I should like to find a genuine loophole. I simply do not believe the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe is preposterous. It leaves me cold. Now, this in psychology is known as the theory of denial. Do you notice the first word in this quotation? Is he referring to evidence for his view? No, it's philosophically I don't like it, okay? In other words, he has a worldview, namely scientific materialism, that rejects the idea of a beginning. So he was very disturbed by this. And some other physicists kind of explained why this was so upsetting. Robert Dickey at Princeton University a couple decades later said, an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of understanding the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. You get the problem? If there's a definite beginning to the universe, then you want to know, if you ask the question, what caused the universe to come into existence, you can't posit a materialistic explanation. There's no matter there to do the causing. It has to be an immaterial cause, a cause which transcends matter. Now, this troubling implication of the new cosmology became more acute because of a discovery, or rather it was a mathematical result, in 1968. It's called the singularity theorem. There were two British physicists, Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist in a wheelchair with Lou Gehrig's disease, and Roger Penrose, solved some of the other equations of Einstein's theory of gravity. They're called the field equations of general relativity. Scott will give you a test on that next week. What they showed was that by solving these equations was that as the universe, as you go back in time, the curvature of space-time, and therefore space itself, gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter until at some point in the remote past, some point in the finite past, the curvature of the universe gets so tight that it corresponds to zero spatial volume. In other words, there's not just a beginning point in time to the expansion, there's a beginning point in space, that space itself comes into existence, before which there was no space and no time. Now let me ask you another question. How much material stuff can you put in no space? Not much, right? Actually, the answer is none, okay? So you can see that these developments in physics and cosmology would have very profoundly anti-materialistic implications. In fact, the picture of the early cosmos was now almost exactly what those pesky medieval theologians had imagined when they came up with their doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, the idea of creation out of nothing physical. And so modern cosmology has been understood by a number of leading astronomers to have decidedly theistic implications. It seems to point to the need for a cause which transcends matter, space, time, and energy. It also oddly confirms the very first words of the Bible, in the beginning. One other little thing it confirms, this has been a private little study of mine, but there are multiple references in the Hebrew Bible, in the prophets and in the Psalms, to God either stretching out the heavens or having stretched out the heavens. So the expanding universe, and if it was only one, I think it was poetic language. It's over a dozen such references. Makes me wonder if maybe those guys knew something. Okay, another area that has, I think, decidedly theistic implications, and that is some discoveries in physics about what's called the fine-tuning of the universe, or sometimes called the anthropic fine-tuning from the word anthros for man. The idea is that there are many parameters of the universe that are beautifully fine-tuned that allow for the possibility of life. For example, this expansion rate that we've been talking about. The universe is expanding at a very particular rate. Turns out that if it was expanding a tiny bit slower or a tiny bit faster, we'd either get a recollapse of the universe, in which case there could be no solar systems, no rocky planets, no life, or we'd get what's called a heat death, where things would expand too quickly and all the energy would be dissipated. And there are several dozen of these fine-tuning parameters where everything is just right. We're in a kind of Goldilocks universe. The expansion rate is not too fast, not too slow. The forces are not too weak, not too strong. The speed of light is not too fast, not too slow. And the physicists have been really pondering about this. Most of these have been discovered since the 1960s. And one physicist, Fred Hoyle, has put it this way. He says, a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. And I said in the last service, I always love the way the monkeys get into these origins debates, even if it's about physics. I also have a fun slide here. This is my universe creating machine, and I got this from an illustration used by the great Cambridge physicist John Polkinghorne. And he says, imagine you're going out into space on a spaceship. Maybe you're on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and you see this space station out in the distance, and you go and you dock there, and it turns out to be a very important space station. There's a sign over the top that says Universe Creating Center. And you go inside the Universe Creating Center, and there's the Universe Creating Machine that's responsible for all the parameters of physics that keep the universe all delicately balanced to make it possible for us to exist. But since you're a physicist, you got a little, you do some calculations, and you realize, there's all these dials and knobs and sliders, and each one represents one of the parameters of the physical universe. And each one of those is set exactly right to allow for the possibility of life. And you make some calculations, you realize, boy, if I moved that speed of light over one little tiny click, life would be impossible for all these reasons that follow from your knowledge of physics. Now, what do you make of it? Polkinghorne, in his charming British understatement, says this. He says, well, I don't say that the atheists are stupid. I just say that theism provides a more satisfying explanation. Design. It points to an intelligent design operating from the very beginning of the universe. Now, the third area of scientific discovery that I think supports this overall thesis is the area in which I work. It's biology. And in biology, you may know, there's been just some extraordinary discoveries in the last 50 years, the last 30 years, the last 20 years. One of them is that inside cells, we are discovering these extraordinary little tiny machines, nanotechnology. My colleague Michael Behe, who is at Lehigh University but also a fellow of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture, wrote an important book called Darwin's Black Box that brought the nanotechnology of the interior world of the cell to public awareness. And one of the machines that he made famous is something called the bacterial flagellar motor. It's a little tiny miniature rotary engine that's been discovered in the cell wall of a bacterium, one of the simplest forms of life. But even in low life, we have high tech. And this motor contains a bush. It has a rotor, a stator, bushings, O-rings, a drive shaft, a U-joint, and a whip-like tail that functions like a propeller that allows the bacterium to chase down its food supply. The whole motor assembly is hardwired into a signal transduction circuit that's giving the bacterium information about, say, changes in sugar gradients. The thing can rotate at 100,000 RPM in some species and reverse direction on a quarter of a turn. It's an exquisite piece of nanotechnology. And there it is in life. And Behe has shown and argued in his book Darwin's Black Box that this provides compelling evidence for intelligent design. Now, without unpacking his argument, I'd like to tell you about the area where I work, which has to do with not the motors and the nanotechnology, but the instructions that are necessary to build these exquisite pieces of biological technology. When I was teaching, I used to ask my students a question. If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And I'll ask you the same question. What do you have to give it? You want to give your computer? Commands. Excellent. Instructions, information, software, code. All these are a correct answer. We know this from our own experience of high-tech digital technology. Well, it turns out the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a bacterial flagellar motor or any of the other intricate machinery that we find inside cells, you've got to build proteins. Proteins are the parts. The protein parts make up these machines. Proteins also are enzymes that are involved in regulating metabolism, and they have all the important jobs in the cell are performed by proteins. But the proteins do their jobs because they have a very precise three-dimensional structure. Keep your eye, for example, on that U-joint in the flagellar motor. Now look at my next slide. The next slide shows how the U-joint is actually made of a protein. Proteins, in turn, are made of smaller subunits called amino acids. If the 20 different amino acids are arranged properly, they will fold into the correct shape that allows the protein to do its job. But that raises a question. What directs the amino acids to get arranged properly so they'll fold into the right three-dimensional shape so you'll have a protein that'll do a job? Well, it turns out there is code inside life. There are instruction sets inside living organisms. And they're coded on a molecule known as DNA. and DNA provides information, literally instructions that direct the construction of these mechanical systems, these proteins and protein parts. Now, we first started to learn about this in the 1950s from Watson and Crick, when they first discovered the structure of the DNA molecule. And here's a picture of the chemical model that they developed. Along the spine of the DNA molecule, you have something called a sugar phosphate backbone, and along the inside of the molecule, there are 4 chemicals called bases that perform that function just like alphabetic letters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. That is to say, the arrangement of those bases conveys instructions that tell the cell how to build the proteins and protein parts and machines that it needs to stay alive. Now, Francis Crick first realized the informational nature of the nucleotide bases in the DNA molecule in 1957 when he proposed something called the sequence hypothesis. And again, the key there was that the arrangement of these characters, they could be arranged in lots of different ways on the DNA molecule, but depending on how they were arranged, they would send instructions for building a protein for a flagellar motor, a protein that was an enzyme, or a protein in another kind of machine. Or if the arrangement was wrong, they'd produce gibberish. So they had to be arranged right. They were informational in that typographic sense. And Bill Gates has acknowledged this in a statement that he's made about DNA. He says DNA is like a computer program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Now, back in the 1980s, when I was working as a geophysicist for an oil company, I was posted here in Houston for a time, but I was mainly posted in Dallas. I ended up meeting some scientists who had become fascinated with the importance of information to biology. And they suggested in a book called The Mystery of Life's Origin that the information in the cell might be pointing to what they called an intelligent cause. Because they said intuitively, information is a mind product. It takes a programmer to make a program. And so they thought, intuitively, the discovery of the information-bearing properties of DNA and the importance of information to life suggested that life might be the product of an intelligence rather than that undirected material process, natural selection, acting on random mutations that we were talking about earlier. Now, I was mentored by one of these scientists, a scientist named Charles Thaxton, for a year while I was working in Dallas when he lived there, and I ended up going off to grad school a year later to England, and I had a big question in the back of my mind as I started my PhD studies. Could this intuition that information comes from intelligence be formulated as a rigorous scientific hypothesis, as a rigorous scientific argument? And as a result of that, my interest, I started studying the scientific method that Darwin had used, because he had pioneered a way of learning about events in the ancient past, about what might have caused events in the ancient past. His method of scientific reasoning was called inference to the best explanation. But that raised a question. What makes an explanation best? And I soon found that he had been influenced by an earlier scientist, a geologist named Charles Lyell, who would answer that question. The best explanation is an explanation that cites a cause which is now in operation, which is, in other words, known to be capable of producing the thing you're trying to explain. Illustration. If you go to eastern Washington today, where I went to college, there's a layer of white ash in the Palouse country where they grow the wheat. If you're a geologist and you don't know what happened in 1980, what do you make of that? Well, you'd use Darwin's method. You propose various competing hypotheses, and then you'd elect the one that best explains the evidence. So you might consider a flood as a possible explanation, or an earthquake, or maybe even a volcanic eruption. Which of those three is the best explanation according to Lyell's criterion? Looking for the causes now in operation, the cause that can produce the effect in question. The volcano, right? Because we know volcanoes produce white ash, and we've never seen floods or earthquakes do that. I got to thinking about that way of reasoning, and I realized that this could be applied to the whole question of the origin of biological information. This was the key question. Where does the information come from that makes life possible? And I came across a scientist who made an offhand comment that really made the nickel drop for me. He said the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. The cause now in operation for the production of information is intelligence. It's a mind. It's conscious and rational thinking. And I thought, well, is that true? Well, of course it is, because whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a section of computer code or a paragraph in a book or a headline in a newspaper or even information embedded in a radio signal, whenever we find information and trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind rather than a material process, not an undirected Darwinian process. And so I realized that there was a powerful scientific case to be made for the idea of intelligent design, a case I've developed in my 2 books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. And the mischievous thing I did was I used Darwin's own method of scientific reasoning to make the case for intelligent design. All right, that's a lot. Let me draw this all together. What have we got? We have evidence for a transcendent cause of the universe as a whole. That's what the new cosmology is showing. It's pointing to the need for a cause beyond the material universe. We have evidence from the fine-tuning of the laws of physics for that transcendent cause being intelligent. We're looking at evidence of design, of a designer acting from the very beginning of the universe, building design into the very fabric of the universe as a whole. And we also now see from biology that we have evidence of that transcendent intelligent cause also acting during the history of life as new information is infused into the biosphere. So when you add that all up, I argue that what we're looking at is not just evidence for an intelligent designer, broadly speaking. We're actually looking at evidence for a designer who is transcendent, intelligent, and active in the creation. In other words, a designer who has theistic attributes, not a deistic designer who only acts at the beginning and lets things go, not a space alien who might be living within the cosmos and seeding life on Earth. No space alien could account for the fine-tuning of the universe as a whole. Instead, when you look at it carefully, I think you have evidence for a designer who has all the attributes that Jews and Christians have always attributed to God. Or we could say it differently, the very attributes that the Bible attributes to God. So we now have historians of science saying things like this, quite in contradiction to these new atheists. The idea that God created the universe is a more respectable hypothesis today than any time in the last 100 years. In other words, St. Paul is right, and Richard Dawkins is not. Thank you very much.